think I would like to open the discussion to the floor. Could you introduce yourself and direct your questions or your whatever assessment of this forum, and be brief, please. Thank you. Yadis. We'll take 3 questions first. Okay, yep. Okay, yep. Sister.
Up these 3 very, very important epistemological principles in this attention triangle. I've never heard of it before. I must say it's been years and years for me personally. Perhaps other people have realized it much earlier, but personally it's been years of research and reading of especially the modern Western authors, epistemologists, philosophers and so on, to realize and to come to this understanding of openness to experience or appreciation of the multiplicity of meanings and multiplicity of the interpretation, as well as the second principle, which was the mind cannot grasp all facts at the same time. There will always be something new coming in, and you will have to be, sort of appreciating of that. So I'm surprised in that way because this is very important and it's all put together in one place, whereas us today, we keep searching all over the places for a very long time until we come to this realization. So my question is linked to this in that way that, again, across the years, I've read Muslim authors, also non-Muslim authors, first of all criticizing Al-Ghazali for, to be the main cause of the decline of Muslim civilization in terms of the knowledge, science, rational thinking, and so on, because he came up with those few famous books refuting Ibn Rushd, and then that was the point whereby everything, the history turned the other way. However, what happened is that recently, some of the same authors who had said this thing before, and also some new authors coming, on the stage, they are actually saying the opposite. They are saying that, basically, sorry, I messed up. The fault was given to Ibn Rushd first, and the praise was given to Al-Ghazali, that he was some sort of savior. At the same time, nowadays, the same authors are actually going on the opposite direction and saying that, well, Al-Ghazali was wrong, and it was Ibn Rushd who was right. And that's, the reason why we are here, we are today, and, summing up all of the rightfully pointed statements this afternoon. The reason why we are today in the state of ignorance and at the state of, sort of refuting other sources of knowledge and sticking to the dry rationalism, induction, deduction, and so on, it's basically because we had been messing up with this too. And of course, it's not very simplistic as put this way, but I wanted to hear from your side, what do you think at that point? I'm not saying somebody is to blame or somebody is to praise, but I just want to hear from your side on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Elma.
Thank you very much. I was tempted by Professor Latas and his idea of poetry. 'Cause actually, we should do more poetry. We can find our souls. With your permission, Mr. Chair, I would like to, a poem of Iqbal that I've, with another friend has translated and I've improved upon it. I just want to share with you. I think this will answer the postmodern question. No, I'm only kidding. I will come to the question. But this is one of Iqbal's great poems. I don't think I'm going to get a chance with this audience again. And in Urdu, it says, "Kabhi eh haqiqat muntazar nazar a libas majaz mein." This is a poem that people in Pakistan and other places, they sing a lot, but I don't think people fully grasp, and I'm hoping that you will be an appreciative audience. Iqbal is talking to the divine, and he's addressing the divine and asking the divine to become manifest in the form of a majaz, in a form of a figurative sense. And the other part, I'm going to explain a couple of things that goes in here. And the other part he talks about, there was a great Mahmud of Ghazna. Mahmud of Ghazna was this great warlord and king of Afghanistan, Mahmud of Ghazna. And there's a famous story of Mahmud having a slave whose name was Ayaz. And they say that Mahmud was besotted with love, whether this is, amoristic love or any other kind of love, the same kind of erotic love that exists between people, between Rumi and Shams and, several others. The question of love, the excess of love and so on. So that also comes into play. So I want you to hear this. He says, "O you, the awaited real, you the awaited real, the real, for once appear in mundane garb. For in my obeisant forehead 1,000 prostrations lie astir. Learn to desire the tumult, or learn to desire the noise of love. Desire the noise of love. You are the melody. Be a confidant to ears. What good is a song if it lies hidden in the quiet of the instrument's frets? Do not be too protective of it. Your heart is the mirror. Your mirror is the mirror. If it is broken, it will be more precious in the eyes of the maker of mirrors." While circling the candle, the glowworm said, "That vintage power to move is absent from your story of burning and missing from my talk of melting. My wretched self found no quarter in the world, and when it did find refuge, where do you think it found sanctuary? I found it in your exclusive forgiveness, where my sin-drenched life found ultimate refuge. Now, love no longer has that fervor, nor does beauty enjoy the charm of playful mischief. The Ghaznavi no longer has that yearning, nor does Ayaz's tresses possess that curl. When I sometimes lay my head prostrate, I hear the earth's reproach to me. Your heart is an intimate of idols. How can you ever profit from prayer?" Iqbal is here putting out this passion about that you must be able to hear the noise of love. This is Rumi's message. The instruments, the ney, the flute. But Iqbal says, what good if a song lies hidden in the instruments? He's wanting the divine to come out, to come and talk to him. And then he talks about the mirror in Persian and Urdu poetry. The mirror is always the heart. And don't be too protective of it, because when the heart breaks, it is even more precious. When the mirror breaks, the pieces are more precious to the mirror maker. And then he tells the story of the glowworm telling the candle that you don't have the power of speech anymore. And the glowworm says, the candle says, I cannot melt anymore. The glowworm melts, and the candle doesn't have the power to speak that powerfully anymore. But this is a very powerful line that Iqbal says, that that when I found myself, when I look, it gets to me better. Na kahin jahan mein ama mili, jo ama mili to kahan mili, mere jurm khane kharab ko tere afwe bande nawaz mein. That when I looked everywhere in the world to find refuge, and when I found the refuge, do you know where I found the refuge? I found the refuge when my sinful heart found refuge in your ultimate grace to forgive. The idea of grace, the divine grace that you have to yearn for, that's what Iqbal talks about. And then he talks about this, that love must have a fervor. It must have fervor. And Nawa ishq mein rahi hai garmiyan, न वह हुस्न में रही हैं शौखियाँ, न वह गज़नवी में तड़प रही, न वह खम है ज़ुल्फ़ अयाज़ में. You know, that love doesn't have that heat and that fervor anymore, and that beauty no longer has that mischief. See, the question of beauty and the question of love is so essential to this tradition. Muslims bask in love and in beauty. The uglification of Islam today is, for me, a real issue. Everything is ugliness. And look at this, the metaphor that Mahmud no longer has that passion, and the long hair of Ayaz no longer has that curl. Remember the beauty in a curl. Can you imagine that sensitivity? और जो मैं सर बसजदा हुआ कभी तो ज़मीं से आने लगी सदा, तेरा दिल तो है सनम आशना, तुझे क्या मिलेगा नमाज में. You know, when I put my head down to pray, the earth speaks to me that your heart is infested and obsessed with idolatry. How can you profit from prayer? The idolatry that we carry in ourselves of all kinds of love for things other than the ultimate, right? Other than the ultimate. And so I think this is the message that I learned from Ghazali, is that, you know, Ghazali gives us the complexity and the question that you raised. Unfortunately, I think that when I raised in this morning, when I said the analysis that some of the reformers made at the time sounded good, but it was was many deficits in that, and we need to thicken that analysis. The analysis that Muslims made, that why were they in the state they were, they said there were two problems. One was that Sufism became the vehicle for superstition, and Muslims lost rationality because superstition took over, and therefore the lack of rationality means that Muslims went backward. And this became the analysis of you know, people connected to Abdu and others and so on, and the whole Arab reform movement also. And who not justified, but who brought Sufism into conversation with the other traditions? Long before Ghazali, there was Hassan al-Basri, there was Qushayri, there were all the other people and so on. But Ghazali is to blame, because Ghazali opened the door for the mystical, right? And Ghazali also criticized some of the Muslim philosophers, Ibn Sina in particular, on a few issues. And because of that, they say that Ghazali put the axe to reason in Islam, and Ghazali axed philosophy. That's unfortunately a very simplistic way of analyzing. It's what I call a scapegoat historiography. It's not real history, it's scapegoat historiography, blaming somebody. And I think we need to get away from the blame game. Ghazali might have been excessive in accusing Ibn Sina and the Muslim philosophers of heresy, because they didn't believe, they conflicted in their analysis with the established theological tradition on three things. They believe that the world emanated, and therefore the world is eternal. They believe that God only knows the universals, not the particulars, and they believe that resurrection will be figurative, or, you know, metaphorical and not literal. So on that basis, Ghazali possibly went a bit hard, and maybe some people took that as a way to go anti-philosophy. But Ghazali was more in love with philosophy than his criticism of philosophy. I mean, that's what some of Ghazali's devout students also said, that Ghazali swallowed philosophy and couldn't vomit it out, even if he tried to. That's what, you know, what's his name, the Maliki scholar from North Africa said. The case is that, you know, Ghazali did his job and he made a contribution. The issue is that, yes, Ibn Rushd became critical of Ghazali, but Ibn Rushd had a different kind of approach, and Ghazali had a different kind of approach. And we need these approaches in different ways in examining material. Sometimes you need Burhan, sometimes you need dialogical reasoning, sometimes you need affective reasoning, the reasoning of emotion that you need, and sometimes you need very kind of deductive and discursive reasoning. These things, life is way too complex to be reduced to one kind of reasoning only. So we need, and these things fit together like a Rubik's cube. You know, it's a complex thing that you have to keep on organizing it and doing it. Unfortunately, people like Muhammad Abid al-Jabari and others in recent years, for instance, also continue this critique and so on. And that's part of a nostalgic thing of Jabri trying to understand why did the Enlightenment happen on that side of the Mediterranean and not happen on this side. And that is because Jabri believes that Ghazali injected into Muslim thought a kind of a dysfunctional and useless Persian Gnosticism, and unfortunately Ibn Hazm's idea, the Rushdi Ibn Hazmi idea of a different kind of rationality that is Burhani based, that didn't take root in Muslim society, even though it generated people like Ibn Khaldun and Shatibi, who were kind of byproduct of that Hazmi Rushdi discourse and so on. Therefore, that didn't happen, and so there's a nostalgia that the Enlightenment could have happened in North Africa. But the Enlightenment is not a single moment. The Enlightenment is a series of activities, and so as much as I appreciate some of the work of Jabri, I don't entirely dismiss him. He makes an important contribution in Islamic thought. I disagree with him on some of these issues. So I think that we have not read Ghazali well. I think Ghazali is much more capable, as is other thinkers in the tradition who require attention and that we can use as meaningful interlocutors. And coming to the question of the postmodern, the postmodern is a critique of the modern. The modern became very arrogant about its own pretensions and its abilities, and that became a critique from within. But then the postmodern also goes into some amount of excess, as the modern goes into excess. And part of that is that the loss of any kind of solidity, everything melts in the air, right? And so what I sometimes find problematic in the postmodern is that the absence of holding on to some kind of metaphysical solidities. But now it cannot be the metaphysics of Farabi or Ibn Sina or Ghazali. Our metaphysics is different. Our universe, our physical universe has changed. The cosmology and the cosmography that we've inherited and the cosmology that we have today is a very different one. I mean, every time you look up into the stars, into the sky, and you see every star there, that star is a sun. Can you imagine? There's gazillions of suns out there. I mean, our sun makes it so difficult to live. Now imagine that is a sun. There's a massive universe around that. I mean, it's just mind-boggling of what we know now of the world in which we're living. Besides, we hardly know who we are. We're just lifting the lid on the mystery of the human being. So I believe that we must give science, it plays a role in our daily function in our lives. Don't give it the ultimate, but we also have to engage with it in a realistic way. And so what I'm saying is that the postmodern, the question of science, none of these things are absolute in the absolute sense. We have relationships with these, and they come in complex formations, and that we have to make use of it to the extent that it delivers for us. And it becomes, meaningful ways of understanding who we are and what we are in the world. But we must have this humility that we cannot know all, and that we can, hold on to some, there's always a limit of what we know, and that we are always open to others. Because we know for sure that many of the things that we held today as absolutes will, as we did to others in the past, will also be looked at in a very different light in the future. So we might still have gravity, but gravity might have a different meaning. Okay? In the same way that, we moved away from a Earth-centered universe to a heliocentric universe. Those things might always be there, but as we realize, different kinds of meanings are imputed. And those meanings come through the things we've just been talking about, of how we understand self in relationship to other and nature around us.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think we are all blessed today because we have heard so many poems being recited, both in Persian and Urdu, from Rumi and Iqbal. The last time IRF had a session with a poet, She was Nikmah Nawab from Saudi Arabia. Yeah, she came, I think, last year. She had 2 events with us. But I think this was more beneficial because, you know, it was recited in the original Urdu and Persian. Yeah, I think we can take 2 more questions, please.
Assalamualaikum. My question is on the domestication on the ethics of responsibility. Sorry for my tone, so overwhelmed by the poems. Yeah, because we know now in a very complex, industrialized, post-capitalist world, injustices can occur in society which are not directly involved, not directly related to any specific individuals. We can say that one individual will cause injustice, but he is not doing something morally wrong. That injustice is at the structural level. So in order to understand this, and in order to create conditions which will reduce the unjustness, the injustices which have been embedded in this kind of society. And this question is directed to both of you. What do you think is the best way to address these questions? Because one of the problems of post-colonial Muslim world is that we inherited the model of capitalism which have been brought by our colonial masters, and we couldn't understand what we are now. And this causes injustices to people who can't live, who don't have the means to live. So, yeah, and how do we go about these kinds of problems of structural injustices? Thank you.
Thank you, Osman. Can we have one last question? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I think I agree with you because we have lost poetry in even our school days too. No longer we recite poetry and the language and the beauty of poetry. You know, talking about spirituality, how is it that it seems that Muslims have made Islam a form and more interested in form rather than the substance, where the aspect of spirituality is not addressed. You talk about being a good Muslim, that means to have this charity, compassion, and so forth. These are all the spiritual qualities that's in a human being. And you talk about that God within ourselves. And Professor Said Alatas was mentioning about the simuk that's in us, the God is within ourselves. That the God-like features that, how is it that we do not seem to bring about this aspect of the human part of it so that we can have a different understanding or appreciation of what our beliefs are?
Yes, okay, there's 2 issues. The first question about structural injustice. When you say structural, you're talking about, in other words, the injustice that arises from a particular economic or political system.
It arises from the relationship between different individuals, and what one people do in the market will affect what other people do in other different sectors.
And you gave the example of capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, now what is your how do we deal with the injustice? Or okay, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I think you see, at one level, it is a matter of dealing with this legally when the injustices arise, and then they have to be redressed. But I don't think you're asking that kind of question, right? If somebody is dealt with unjustly in a system, then there is recourse to the law or activism or that kind of thing. But that's not what you're talking about. How do we theoretically deal with this in the kinds of knowledge that we are trying to create about for knowledge that is relevant for our world today? Maybe that's what you are asking. Now, first of all, I mean, if we just take the example of the economy, right? You talked about capitalism. Now, you have to realize that capitalism is a system that we have inherited. It was largely introduced in the colonial period, and even if it wasn't, it was the destiny of the world to become capitalist, right? It's a system that developed in Western Europe, gradually spread throughout the world, and it is rooted everywhere. Now the question really is, how can we, it is childish to, to say that we can create another system and, and detach ourselves from the rest of the world. What is likely to happen, as has happened in the past, is that large societies, large parts of the world, or even the whole world, gradually evolves from one system to another. So we have certainly seen a change from more feudal-like systems as you had in Europe, or even in the Malay world, or other kinds of pre-modern systems had gradually evolved, either through colonialism or indirectly through the influence of the political economies of Western Europe and later America. Gradually, the whole world became capitalist, and it is likely that some other kind of system, which we cannot imagine for now, will develop in the future. Socialism was a failed experiment that did not happen, but it did very much influence capitalism. And this is getting to your answer. In the beginning, in Western Europe, in the time of Karl Marx, when capitalism was in its early stages, the capitalists, the early evolving bourgeoisie in the 18th century onwards, did not envisage things like minimum wage, for example. That wasn't in the plans. Or restricting the working day. These were not in the plans. But it is because of decades of struggle of the working class movement, especially during the time of the ideas of Marx, Marx and Engels played a very important role in terms of conscientizing the working class about the nature and workings of capitalism. So, as a result of the struggle of the working class, capitalists made concessions to them. And this included minimum wages, it included restricting the working day, to so many hours of work, and many other, social security. Social security, minimum wage, these are basic to our economic system today. But they were by no means thought of as part of integral to capitalism. In fact, the early capitalists would have been horrified by such ideas. So, now, modern Muslims have grown up in the capitalist system. Now, in our search to find an authentic economic system, we have dreamed up a supposedly new science called Islamic economics, which pretends to present an alternative to both capitalism and socialism. So theoretically, you have Islamic economics, and in the practical sense, you have the Islamic banking and finance system. Now, the reality of the matter is that, I would say, and I've argued this before, I've written about it also, that Islamic economics is bourgeois ideology. It is an ideology for capitalism, both in terms of theory and function, in terms of theory and practice. Islamic economics really is neoclassical economics, as the Malays say, yang diperhiaskan dengan istilah-istilah keislaman. This is stuck in my mind because I think I first wrote that paper in Malay. And it sounds much nicer in Malay anyway. Okay, Islamic economics is yang diperhiaskan, meaning it is beautified, beautified with Islamic terminology. Neoclassical economics beautified with Islamic terminology. And because the early Islamic economists, a lot of them from Pakistan, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, from Pakistan, trained in neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics. And then in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the research was funded by Saudi Arabia, created a body of knowledge which was basically tinkering with and modifying the dominant economic theories and doctrines. Now, the problem with this is that, with this kind of economics, is that it buys into the basic principles of capitalism. For example, the basic notion of exploitation, which has been criticized by Marxist economics, has never been dealt with by Islamic economics. The labor theory of value, and tied to that is the notion of the fact that the worker does not get in his wage the full value of what he put into the product. This is how Marxism defines exploitation. The Islamic economists haven't dealt with the issue of exploitation and how to define it, even if they disagree with the Marxist definition, but they have not even dealt with it at a theoretical level. Now, in practical terms, Islamic banking and finance system cannot exist outside of the confines of capitalism. It is part and parcel of it. Huh? Well, okay, in a sense it may be worse because it's making certain claims. Capitalism doesn't make any claims of loftiness, and it doesn't claim to aid the believer, in his journey towards the afterlife. But Islamic economics does, because it's supposed to be based on on tazkiyah and a few other spiritual principles that are supposed to underlie Islamic economics. So the problem is partly, I would say, to put it in simple terms, partly a problem of Eurocentrism. When I say Eurocentrism, what I mean is, even where we claim to provide an alternative knowledge system or an alternative discipline, we have actually imitated the existing dominant narrative, in this case, conventional economic theory and doctrine. We have imitated it and, tinkered around with it, modified it here and there. On the ISLM curve, we take out the I part, the interest part. Okay? But basically, it's the same logic, same way of thinking. And in the banking system is the practical dimension of that. So this is basically a problem of imitation. But then there's also the political problem of our Muslim countries and leaders not having the political will to create something different. I mean, the OIC, for example, or blocks of Muslim countries, even in Southeast Asia, we have not, Indonesia, Malaysia, we haven't been able to integrate ourselves economically in a political economic way, something like the European Community, where we can then experiment with alternative ways of doing political economy. So, but finally I will say that I think the whole idea of respect for humanity and the dignity of the individual doesn't exist in our ulama. It's not taught, and we have our ulama have a very authoritarian mentality. It goes back to their notion of God, because they were educated to think of God as a fearful being that is, looking out to get us, to punish us, right? Now, when you have a notion of the Father like that, that authoritarian, those authoritarian traits that you associate with the Father are transferred to the Son, right? And the Son develops an authoritarian personality. And you see, why is it? It's not an accident that all Islamic states are authoritarian states. They're not democratic states. How come they reject democracy for being, what do you call kufr, something? Nizam al-kufr. But authoritarian states are not Nizam al-kufr. So this is the domination of the authoritarian mind. So, the answer to your question is very complex.
Let me just give it a small go. So what I heard you ask is about the way I heard your question about structuralism. So I think you got a very profound analysis by Professor Alatas. The only thing I will say is that that there's been a tendency on the part of some thinkers to attribute all causation to structure. That structure causes everything. So there's no way that you can analyze things, but the structures are there. And I think part of even Marxism had to retreat from this heavy notion of, of base and superstructure. The base is the material condition and the superstructure is the ideology. And then finally Marxism had to realize, Gramsci and others had to talk about the realignment between the base and the superstructure and the kind of dialectical relationship. Although to be a Marxist, you had to finally believe in the finality of the base, that the base determines, the material condition determines. But I think there's been a great deal of analytical work. One group of thinkers, amongst anthropologists and sociologists in particular, that everything is causatively attributed to structure. And for me, that is a little bit about kind of structuralism going on speed. Structuralism is going out of control. Because I think one of the things we learn again from Gramsci is that hegemony can never be complete. Hegemony is always incomplete. So even the structure might think it has us, it doesn't really have us. Because there's always the notion of human agency. Human agency can always hit back and find the hole and find the gap and then reopen. So as I think the new phenomena and what we find overwhelming is this overwhelming nature, and this is part that I'm very weak in, and I struggle, and I need to talk to people who know better about this, is the way in which world economy and global economy works, and liberal capitalism, right? But before that, we had other iterations of capital, mercantile capitalism, emporium capitalism in this area here, when the beginning is the rise of state capitalism in Europe, in which the state becomes a capitalist and accumulates, and then surplus goes to the state, and that's how we have colonialism and so on. So I think liberal capitalism is a kind of a different ball game, and how we deal with that has still been a dilemma. The problem, I have a number of colleagues and so on who, when they talk about this, as if you can just wish away the conditions under which we are, right? Liberalism is the problem. But it's not entirely the problem, right? Liberalism has problems of its claims to universalism and so on, but there are also positive features of liberalism, some of which, without which we cannot do certain things, and has been seen as an advance on other forms. But they are also, so all these things are not completed, they are not total solutions, but we always struggle with them and we utilize them in different ways. The last questioner who asked about the place of the divine, and so how can I answer that but through another poem of Iqbal? So Iqbal talks about khudi, selfhood. Khudi is at the term khudi was in Persian, poetics, used as a very kind of negative term, as selfishness. Khudi, selfishness, egotistic, very haughty, egotistic term. But Iqbal turns this thing around and turns khudi into a positive sense of self-affirmation, self-making, self-uplifting. And so that is very much at the center of Iqbal's idea of that, khudi is the core of our humanity and all human development is to actualize this. And so therefore we have this perpetual dance between transcendence and immanence. That immanence in the world, that we have the manifestation of immanence and how the divine becomes immanent in some ways, but the divine is also transcendent. As we heard earlier that, God is closer to us than a jugular vein, and then also there's nothing like unto him. Laysa kamithlihi shay. But we're also close to the human beings than the jugular. So this perpetual dance between immanence and transcendence. And so Iqbal then forcefully articulates this in this poem. He says, this is a Persian poem that Mustansir Mir translated. God has lost us. God has lost us. He is in search of us. Like us, he feels need and is a captive of desire. At times, he inscribes his message on the petals of tulips. At times, he makes ecstatic chant in the breasts of birds. At times, he inscribes his message on the petals of tulips. At times, he makes ecstatic chant in the breasts of birds. He reposes in the narcissus that he may view our beauty. He is so adept at wooing that his looks makes conversation. The sighs he draws at dawn in separation from us are inside and outside, above and below, all around. The sighs he draws at dawn in separation from us are inside and outside, above and below, all around. He has caused all the stir that he might observe the creature of dust. The pageant of scent and color is but a pretext for watching. The pageant of scent and color is but a pretext for watching. He is hidden in every particle and yet is a stranger. He is conspicuous like the moon and is caressed by town and street. In this dust bowl of ours, in this dust bowl of ours is lost the pearl of life. This lost pearl, is it we or is it he? In this dust bowl of ours is lost the pearl of life. This lost pearl, is it we or is it he? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Yeah, okay.
I didn't answer the gentleman's question there. I'm sorry about that. I'll just do it very briefly. You're asking why do we have this lack of spiritualism? Why do we have the legalism? Of course, there is a whole history of this legalistic outlook in Islam. But notwithstanding that continuity, the question is why in this day and age is it more prominent? It has part of the reason, just part of the reason, is because there is an affinity between a legalistic approach to religion and modern capitalism. You have to realize that we are living today, in the last 300 years, in a kind of system that's very unlike previous systems. What capitalism is about predictability, efficiency, calculability, substitution of humans with technology. And this logic has affected every area of life, not just our economic transactions, but also our political transactions, our political lives, even our social lives. It is threatening to even affect our marriage life. Well, for example, now Muslims, I think, are being asked to take courses so you can have a good marriage. So this kind of, infantile mentality that you can teach people, let them take a course and teach them, then it will lessen the rate of divorce, right? This way of fixing problems. Now, so I'm saying the ethic, the logic of capitalism is such that it has invaded other areas of life. Okay, the calculable logic of capitalism, for example. So, when we think about devotion, about ibadah, about practice, okay, we're thinking in terms of how many times to mention the zikr, how many times have I did the right number of times, as if God is counting. Because our notion of God also, we project, we think of God in terms of our capitalist logic. And some people have even done away with the tasbih because it's inefficient. They use a counter. And the Christians also do that. They use a counter. So the invasion of the capitalist logic into the religious sphere supports legalistic outlook in religion.
Thank you so much, Prof. That's very good. Yeah, I think we are almost 5 p.m. It's time for us to wind up. I would like to call upon, first of all, I'd like to thank both of you for being here with us. And as a brief reminder, we're going to have a roundtable discussion tomorrow at Nottingham University, Jalan Raja Chulan, just across, close to Pavilion, Chulan Tower, okay? Level 2, if I'm not mistaken, Chulan Tower. And it's going to be a very interesting roundtable discussion about is Islam a religion of peace? And we'll have Prof. Ibrahim Musa to present his view, and he's going to be intervened with 3 interveners, including Dr. Adis Dudrija, Andrew Koo, and I. And I would like to call upon Mr. Chairman, Mr. Osman Softik, who is a research fellow with IRF. He is from Bosnia and he just arrived yesterday. I'll give the floor to him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farouk.